Hello everyone, and welcome back to another Mirror Dungeon solo video. In today's episode, we'll be using a very strange identity in the form of Kurokumo Hong Lu. I say he's strange because he's a bleed identity who doesn't particularly like bleed. Or I should say he doesn't like too much bleed. A little bit here and there is fine, but if you start sacking up really high, he really doesn't appreciate it. The main reason for this is because of his skill 2's unique effects. If he is attacking an enemy who has less than 4 bleed count, it will gain an extra 2 coins. This effect gives him really good versatility as a DPS unit, but if you start building a bleed stack too much, he takes a massive nosedive into viability. However, because the conditional is specifically tied to before attack, he is not entirely useless in a bleed team. Let's say, hypothetically, he is attacking an enemy with 6 bleed count. If he was simply doing a one-sided attack, he would not get the bonus coins. However, if he is clashing and they have specifically 3 coins, the bleed count would reduce 3 times, allowing his conditional to activate and give him the bonus coins. I can see the vision that Project Moon had when they were designing him. He's supposed to win clashes, lowering the target's bleed count to a point where his conditional then activates. The problem is that in practice, this doesn't exactly work. First, it's difficult to even get the perfect bleed count in the first place. You need to inflict enough bleed count that whatever skill he's clashing with doesn't kill the stack, and not too much so that his conditional also doesn't activate. And if you even manage to pull this off, you better hope the enemy doesn't have another skill lined up, because Hong Lu himself doesn't have any bleed count, and with only 3 count left, it's pretty likely another attack will end up destroying the stack. And that's not even taking into account his absolutely terrible clash power to begin with. None of his skills are capable of rolling higher than a 13, which makes him miserable to try and win clashes with. At the very least, his skill 3 has a ton of paralyze, and with his decent speed he can reliably inflict it so that someone else can take advantage of it. And that brings me to his skill 3. Aside from its absolutely horrendous roll, it's fine for the most part. However, it does have one specific line that confuses me to no end. It says, "Combat start, this skill inflicts 1 additional bleed and paralyze." At first, I thought this line existed for the scenario in which he has multiple skill slots, and thus is capable of using multiple skill 3s in the same turn. I was under the assumption that if you use 2 skill 3s, for example, instead of him inflicting only 6 paralyze with each skill, he would instead inflict 7. Unfortunately, that's not how it works, and they still only inflict 6 each, which brings me to my point. Why does this line even exist? They could just make it inflict 6 paralyze on hit instead of 5 and get rid of this stupid, pointless line, and absolutely nothing would change. Anyway, to start the run off, we take Wound Claret and Little and To Be Naughty plushie for our starting gifts and choose the Forgotten for the first floor. For this boss, we're up against G-Corp, who is not that big of a threat. With the only attacks we're fatal to coming from the general, we can avoid getting staggered for the whole fight. Being so early on in the run, our poor clash power is yet to pose an issue, and as such we can make it through relatively easily. The biggest thing to note is that I did contemplate whether or not I should actually upgrade Wound Claret. With a given bleed count, it could become a problem by turning off Hong Lu's bonus skill 2 coins, but ultimately I concluded that whatever damage comes from a full bleed stack would likely outperform the damage from Hong Lu's skill 2, and as such I upgraded it.
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요. 되는 건 즐겁네요. 되는 건 즐겁네요.
We take Carmilla for a reward and head into Lake World for the next floor. Here we buy Blue Zippo Lighter and Lithograph before being immediately accosted by one of the hardest fights in the entire run against the middle. Now with both Carmilla and Blue Zippo Lighter, this fight would normally not be an issue at all, but because Carmilla is not fully upgraded, and this fight is directly after the shop, needless to say it was a struggle. We are quadruple fatal to the middle, and with all of our egos being fatal to envy damage, there is no way for us to reduce the amount taken, other than of course by staggering the enemies. We have enough ego resources to be able to use Cavernous Wailing on the first turn to stagger 3 of them, but unfortunately even with Hong Lu's superpowered skill 2, it's not enough to kill any of them when they are staggered. Most of this fight boils down to just pure luck. We need to get lucky and clash with the only one we didn't stagger on the second turn to stagger them for the next, after which we can use Dimension Shredder to target one of the enemies in the back to take less damage. We basically can't win any clashes with our regular skills, not only because of their default poor rolls, but also because of the middle's debuffs, and as such we have to rely on bleed to do most of the work for us.
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요.
With that being the only real challenging fight of the floor, we make it to the boss against the Twin Hook Pirates. They are significantly easier than the middle. They only ever do slash damage, and with us having a slash resistance, the only thing that actually threatens us is bleed damage. But with there only ever being 4 enemies at a time, it's pretty easy to deal with. They can never really stack it up too high, and with the extra coins from our skill 2, plus bleed damage of our own, we can cut our way through the pirate hordes in no time at all.
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요.
효율적인 대처로 개체를 꿰뚫었습니다. 참고로 기계는 입에 발린 말 따위 쉽게 하지 않아요.
방금 전격 다음에 다른 대체기도 다시 해봐줄래? 영상으로 남겨.
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요. 좀 더 잘 될 수 있을 것 같은데요. 되는 건 즐겁네요. 되는 건 즐겁네요.
저기는 땅에 떨어졌네.
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요. 좀 더 잘 될 수 되는 건 즐겁네요.
대성공이야. 가랑 신나. 노래 부를까?
좀 더 잘 될 수 있을 것 같은데요.
완전 프레스 선택이었어 나리. 약점이 뻔히 보이게로군.
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요. 좀 더 잘 될 수 되는 건 즐겁네요.
이제야 실력을 좀 내시네.
되는 건 즐겁네요.
얼마나 좋습니까?
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요. 되는 건 즐겁네요.
엄청나게 강한 일격을.
되는 건 즐겁네요.
아까 했던 공격.
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요. 되는 건 즐겁네요.
올바른 방법으로 보스에게 일격을 가해주. 이것이
되는 건 즐겁네요.
We take Broken Revolver for our reward and receive the Rusted Cutting Knife as a bonus before heading into Emotional Craving for the next floor. We don't find anything of note here before making it to the boss against the Wayward Passenger. Despite the fact that we are resistant to slash damage, this fight is still quite challenging. Most of this comes down to the fact that winning a clash is essentially a 50-50, plus the occasional envy and rupture damage coming our way. We barely managed to avoid getting staggered on the first turn, but honestly I think it would have been better to get staggered there. The passenger always retreats into his portals on the second turn, so if you get staggered then, you don't need to worry about taking any damage. Of course, this allows his portal buffs to activate, which makes winning clashes and surviving the later turns even more difficult. Being that I'm not stagger, though, I try to use an ego to destroy as many portals as possible, but unfortunately my luck fails me, and I end up not destroying a single one. When the passenger does return with all of his buffs, he could very easily kill us as, again, we can't clash with anything. Luckily, one of his parts is right on the verge of being staggered, but he did speed tie with us and would move first anyway. His other blade ended up being even faster than us, allowing us to clash with an ego and stagger the more threatening part before he retreated back to his portals. This time, we're able to defeat most of them, preventing the passenger from getting any stronger. Unfortunately, the problem of being bad at clashing still persists, and it brings me to one of the few good things I can say about this identity. If he manages to win a clash with his skill 3, every other clash afterwards is pretty easy, no matter how bad your roll is thanks to the paralysis. This essentially makes it so that we only need to ever win at least one clash per turn, and bleed can do most of the rest of the work for us.
되는 건 즐겁네요.
대성공이야. 당신이야. 노력해.
되는 건 즐겁네요.
적에게 치명성을 입혔군요. 관리자님, 당신이 생각하는
되는 건
대단한 능력을
즐겁네요.
가지고 있는
세들의 세력이
제가
많이
늘
바뀌어나갔어. 괴로워하는 게
저는
느껴지지
언제나
않아? 우리 기세로 계속 나아가보자.
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요. 되는 건 즐겁네요.
직원들이 개체를
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요.
쨍그라. 둘다 처방했어. 계속해도 돼.
좀 더 잘 될 수 있을 것 같은데요. 좀 더 잘 될 수 있을 것 같은데요. 괜찮죠? 재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요.
앞으로도 관심을 해주세요.
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요.
We take the rusted muzzle for our reward and head into Rising Power Supply for the next floor. Here we buy Late Bloomer's Tattoo and Bloody Gadget while also finding Smokes and Wires as well as Special Contract. We also fuse Respite, which is probably the single worst ego gift for this identity, before making it to the boss against KQE.
좋아.
Respite is so bad because it essentially permanently disables Hong Lu's skill 2's main gimmick. If you ever win a clash with his skill 2 and you have Respite, he will never get his bonus coins because it immediately inflicts a 5 bleed count. As for the fight against KQE, it's obviously incredibly easy because it's against KQE. Even though he does blunt damage, he only has 3 skill slots and has rolls equal to our own. We don't need to worry about losing clashes or any damage because KQE is an absolute pushover. We managed to stagger him before he does his captivity, which makes it so when he recovers it becomes clashable. This is the one skill that would require an ego to beat, but with it being KQE, I don't want to use an ego and choose to just tank it.
없겠지만 그렇게 할게요.
개체 부위가 파괴되었습니다. 대형 매뉴얼을 어느 정도 숙지하셨나 보다.
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요.
큰 거 온다.
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요.
승객이 딱콩 한 방 먹였어. 방금 공격. 다음에 다른 개체에게도 다시 해봐줄래? 영상으로 남기면 다른 직원에게도 도움이 될 수 있냐?
들을진 몰라도 그때를 위해서 미리 음원을 녹음해야 한다는 거군요. 아 이런, 이것도 녹음되고 있는지는 미처 몰랐네요.
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요. 되는 건 즐겁네요.
We take lowest star as our reward and head into a certain world for the final floor. Here we buy the Chief Butler's secret arts and the material interference force field, as well as an extra skill 3 before making it to the final boss against Nelly. This is the second fight in the run that I would consider to be truly difficult for two specific reasons that stem from, you guessed it, our absolutely horrific clash power. The first problem is fairly obvious. Just like the Wayward Passenger, we essentially have a 50% chance to win our first clash. The second problem is her evade. The only way we can beat it is if she rolls tails on our second coin. This matters because we need the damage to stagger Nelly by the third turn, but more importantly we need the skill 3's paralysis. While we are certainly not the frailest identity in the world, Nelly can very easily stagger us by the third turn if she continuously rolls heads. The paralysis makes it significantly easier to survive long enough to stagger her instead on the third turn. 90% of all attempts at this fight came from either losing the first clash or Nelly evading everything, but eventually I got a run where everything lined up and we made it to the third turn. Nelly did end up inflicting us with a single paralysis of her own, which coupled with our shit clash power made me quite scared to attempt any clashes. We had to clash with her though, as the only way to guarantee a stagger would be through the use of bleed damage, and so I used a single ego to eat up the paralysis and more or less ensure victory. Once she's staggered, Special Contract does its thing and bleed does the rest.
방금 공격은 좋았어. 이대로만 계속
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요.
효율적인 대처로 개체를 꿰뚫었습니다.
재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요. 재미는 없겠지만 그렇게 할게요. 되는 건 즐겁네요. 가야 할 곳으로 보내준 것뿐이죠. 보이는 걸 베어냈을 뿐이고요.
And that's how I soloed Mirror Dungeon 4 hard using only Kurokumo Hong Lu. A genuinely awful identity who's so poorly designed he doesn't even fit into his own status archetype. I mean, I see what they were going for with him, but a max bleed stack will always be doing more damage than his extra 2 coins ever will. The only real reason to use him is if you want the paralysis. Otherwise, you're just better off using base Hong Lu. He's literally better in every conceivable way. Anyway, that's it from me. Like and subscribe to not miss next time where we'll be using this character. Goodbye.